They say two heads are better than one. We're about to put that to the test.
Welcome to Two Heads Are Better Than One, the podcast where two former Scottish head teachers get to say what they really think about schools, leadership and life beyond the head's office.
I'm Rod Grant. I spent 20 years running Clifton Hall School in Edinburgh.
And I'm Cameron Wyllie. I worked at George Heriot's School in Edinburgh for 27 years and ended up as the principal.
This podcast isn't about dusty policy papers or dry theory. It's about stories, insights and a look behind the curtain of school leadership. The good, the bad and the surprisingly funny.
We'll talk about what schools get right, what they get wrong and what you never hear about in the official speeches.
So to kick off, we're asking the big question: what really makes a school great?
And the obvious place to start is with teachers. The right bunch of teachers in the right place, in the right school, people who have the right attitude towards it. So, Rod, is teaching a vocation?
Yeah, I think some people view teaching almost as a science, and I've never really viewed it that way. It's a very data-rich environment often. Certainly in government circles, they love their data. I've always thought that teaching was very much an art, a craft, and that schools that function really well are those that develop relationships, where teachers speak with other teachers in a warm and affectionate way, and to their pupils, and vice versa. And of course, in many schools, parents are a very important element to that. So for me, yes, a vocation, definitely an art, there's a craft to teaching, and it should heavily be based on the quality of relationships within a school.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think that good teachers have to have two capacities. The first capacity is that in secondary schools, they need to really love their subjects. But actually, more importantly than that, for all teachers in primary and secondary schools, the key thing is that they really need to like working with young people. Your point about teachers and teachers is very interesting, about, the warm and affectionate relationship between teachers, because I sometimes think actually teachers are a wee bit too warm and affectionate to each other, and that the collegiality which teachers have, the strength of the staff room, is sometimes a bit too strong, particularly in situations where some colleagues are not very good at what they are doing. Teachers are not great at pointing that out.
No, that's really true. I think one of the joys of my particular role at Clifton Hall was I had the opportunity of taking a school from a primary to an all-through school. And that left me with about 6 months to redesign and structure the buildings in a way that I thought would be most appropriate for a school. So in many schools that I've been in, you see lots of little departmental staff rooms where people are tucked away in the corner and you never see them from one year to the next. And I specifically designed the school at Clifton Hall to have one staff room, to make it more collegiate. And I think the benefit of that was that primary staff interacted with secondary staff in a way that maybe doesn't happen in other settings. And I found that really valuable. Yes, of course, the problem with that collegiality is that you will always get the dinosaur in the corner who's a bit of a moaner and will then try to form a tribe of moans, which usually are aimed at management or leadership. And that can be tricky. But I think the best way actually to counteract that is to have a setting where those teachers are very public and that they can't hide away in their little ivory towers chatting with one or two colleagues. Yes, I mean, I completely understand that, teachers have quite a difficult role. And when things are not going particularly well in a school or in their classroom or in their subject or with their colleagues, then there is that opportunity to moan.
The difficulty with teaching in some respects as a profession is about scrutiny. So when I started teaching at Daniel Stewart's and Melville College 147 years ago, I was, on those days, of course, I did 2 years of probation. And during my 2 years of probation, I was observed once a year. So my head of department, who I loved, came in and watched me teach, and then he wrote 3 sentences on a piece of paper, and at the end of the year produced what in those years was called the pink slip, which was a piece of A5 paper. It was pink, and on which he had to comment on various aspects of my teaching. And he wrote, "Excellent, excellent, excellent. I think Mr. Wyllie should proceed to his second year of probation." And in the second year he wrote, excellent, excellent, excellent. Mr. Wyllie is an excellent teacher. Now, by comparison, probationary teachers have to spend half their lives filling in evidence to progress forward, and there needs to be a balance between these two different things. If you're a megalomaniac, teaching is a great profession because you go in, you're in charge of that classroom. We can come back later to the fact that an awful lot of teachers are no longer in charge of their classrooms for various reasons. But generally speaking, you go in, you're in charge. Nobody else is there. And I have to confess, that was one of the things I really liked about teaching. I hated being watched as a teacher by inspectors, by student teachers, by colleagues. I really didn't like it at all. I wanted it to be me and the class. And I think that if you get the right teacher in the right setting with the right support, that works really well. But the trouble is, the crap teacher, to invent a technical term, they are really in a pretty secure position too, because it's very, very, very difficult to do much about crap teachers.
Yeah, that's true. It takes me back actually to working in a local authority school in West Lothian. And I used to close the door, having been told that I had to have a certain number of maths groups and I had to do a certain amount of time based on the curriculum. About 15% must be on environmental studies. And I basically closed the door and did it absolutely my way. And the kids were very much with me on that. They kind of knew that I was doing things differently, and they went with it, because I couldn't really for the life of me see why we had in that school, it was a class of 33, so it was a big class, and they had 3 maths groups, which were separated by, I think from memory, around 35 pages of the same textbook. And yes, of course, though, the high flyers, there were 2 or 3 at the top that were probably doing the equivalent of third year maths, and they were age 11. And then there was a couple of boys down who were really, really struggling. One wee lad couldn't actually even spell his name. And so yes, you were very careful and cautious about making sure that the work you give them was appropriate. But then you had this huge group of about 28 kids who could be taught as a class. So I thought, well, I don't care what the deputy head and the head's telling me to do and what the local authorities expect me to do. I'm going to close my door and I'm going to teach the class.
I think that good teachers have always not done what they're told a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the problems is that there are various kinds of philosophies of education that have come in, both in England and in Scotland. And I think that adherence to these philosophies of education can be very damaging. And I think you've got to let teachers have their own head to a far greater extent than is allowed at the moment, and indeed head teachers too. Head teachers are a different ballpark, and we can talk about them some other time.
Yeah, and I think this is all leads to that word autonomy. I think autonomy is massively important in schools, that the teachers know the kids in front of them, or they should know the kids in front of them, inside out. And they need that space to be able to lead their classroom in the way they see fit, not to some kind of construct. I often think about this in terms of curriculum as well, Cameron. Every country has its own curriculum, and yet we bang on about, the curriculum for excellence, and is it the right way forward, and are we doing the right things? And I'm not so sure that actually what you're teaching really is that important. It's how it's taught and how you develop within your students a kind of love of learning and the capacity to think critically. I think so much of what happens in schools now, actually, it's almost as if we want the kids only ever to give us the right answer.
Yeah, well, I agree with that up to a point. I think that a return to the knowledge-based curriculum is going to eventually happen in Scotland in the way it has in England. And that's led to the massive improvement in results in England, and to the fact that children are happier in schools and parental satisfaction is higher in England. Who would have thought 50 years ago that that was even possible, that Scottish education could be outpaced by English education? I wondered, though, just what you thought about teacher training, because one of the essences of this is getting the right people into the profession. So you somehow have to do something about that. Paying them more is obviously one way forward, but encouraging them to believe that teaching is a really satisfactory life is also a very important way forward. What do you think about teacher training and how we should train teachers? Are we doing that right? Or do you think universities had too much of a role to play?
Well, that's a really tricky question because, of course, you think back to your own experience and the number of trainee teachers who passed the course, who, when you're being genuine and you're looking at it with some level of perspective, you think, actually, they shouldn't be in a classroom. There's a part of me that thinks that universities are in some way a little bit too soft about letting people get through their courses into being a qualified teacher.
I just wouldn't let the universities be doing it.
Yeah.
I mean, the bottom line is I think the universities have far too much say on what happens in Scottish schools, far too much. And one of the ways that is true is in teacher training. I mean, it was proposed about 20 years ago, as you will remember, that the teacher training colleges should be shut and that some staff from teacher training colleges should go to schools and that every school should have somebody who's in charge of teacher training so that young people coming from universities learned on the job. So they got their degrees either in primary education back then or they got their degrees in their subject-specific secondary specialities, and then they just went into a school and they started to teach. I think that would have been great. But of course, the problem with that was the universities. They didn't want that. I think a lot of people who taught education in universities aren't all that keen on actually being in a school with the young people shouting in the corridors. And also, the other problem with that was to do with the unions, and the unions didn't want that either. Because, of course, as you, I'm sure, agree, Rod, the unions are the most reactionary forces in Scottish education because they really refuse to do anything about changing anything. So the first step towards great teachers would be having great teacher training and putting it into schools. I think most teachers would agree with that.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, but that's because of my circuitous route into teaching. Because actually, I was employed as a teacher in a small preparatory school in Ayrshire with non-qualified status. And back in the late 80s, you could get away with that. So actually, I was employed as a housemaster with no teaching. But as happens in small schools, I suddenly found myself in the classroom, and within 3 years I'd become head of geography, even though my degree was English. The problem with that is, of course, people will throw their hands up in horror and say, that's absolutely astonishing, ridiculous, it should never have happened. But from a personal perspective, my teaching by the end of that 3 years was, I think, could fairly be regarded as high quality. And I then decided that teaching was my vocation, as we talked about earlier, was the profession that I wanted to spend my life pursuing. And I then went to teacher training college. And actually at teacher training college, I sailed through it because I'd already gained the tools, I'd done it. Now, I'm not suggesting that we go to that model, but I think your idea of actually the training taking place in schools, I would say 100% of the time, would be of phenomenal importance and lead to a greater degree of understanding of the system. And it would also lead to, I think, teachers deciding whether or not this was for them.
The Teach First model, for example, in England, where graduates could go straight into schools and start teaching, had met with mixed success. And that mixed success was, of course, because some people make better teachers than other people do. So there are people who could step into a classroom and start teaching and be very good indeed, I think. And there are other people who, with PhDs in educational theory and any amount of academic expertise, actually just are very good teachers. I had a student teacher a long time ago who was a PhD, and her lesson preparation was brilliant. But she was so easily discouraged by things going wrong in the classroom. So what you'd have a situation where the lesson would be going along pretty well, swimmingly, and I'd be making wee notes saying, this is good, this is good, this is good. And then two boys would start talking at the back of the room. And she'd ask them to be quiet, and they wouldn't be quiet. They just kind of carry on whispering to each other. And that was it. The lesson was, as far as she was concerned, over because she had failed in this time. And one of the lessons about teaching is, it's never going to be perfect. You're constantly going to find yourself in situations where you are thinking, actually, this wasn't very good. And one of the great things about my career as a teacher is that I've never indulged in too much reflection, and I'm one of the least self-critical people you could ever hope to meet. So if I had a terrible lesson, that was a terrible lesson, the next one would do better. And I didn't even congratulate myself too much about the good ones. So the point is, you just moved along, you just got on with it. The distinction between teaching and a lot of other professions is this, that if you are a brain surgeon, it doesn't do to make a mistake.
No, you can't have a bad day.
Now, Henry Marsh, the very distinguished brain surgeon, in his book Do No Harm, talks about an instance in which he was supervising a younger doctor to do something, and the younger doctor did it wrongly and led to an enormous litigation against the hospital. And he talks very interestingly about the degree of guilt he felt because the patient, let's put it this way, was ruined effectively because of this mistake that this doctor had made. And I think that the point is that never happens in teaching. You're never going to, you can have really bad days or really bad weeks, which aren't all that good. At the end of the day, it's some huge arc in teaching that affects your view of yourself and young people's view of you and their parents' view of you. It's not about individual lessons, really, ever.
No, and it goes back to that point. It's about developing relationships within your classroom.
Absolutely. And the best way of teaching young teachers how to develop relationships in a classroom is to put them into a classroom, is not to give them endless degrees of theorizing, because there's a real disconnect, I think, between the academics who are both involved in theory of education and in teaching teachers and the actual practice of what is going on in schools. Increasingly, as difficult things become more difficult in Scottish schools, particularly in terms of behaviour, in terms of ethos, in terms of discipline, then you're finding young Scottish teachers who are just saying, I just can't do this at all. When in fact, they probably could if they had been supported in a different way.
Yes, and let's go back then to what makes a great school. So we've talked about relationships. We've talked about teacher training. We've talked about the staff room. What else are we missing?
Well, I mean, the essential thing is about the kind of overall ethos of what's going on at the school, the atmosphere, the environment, the culture code, the culture. Yeah, absolutely. And the bottom line is that has to be a meeting place between pastoral care and discipline. These two things I see as being utterly locked together. I know that people who read what I write in my paper or who listen to me talking about education probably now think of me as being somewhat to the right of a till of a hun, because I bang on about discipline all the time. Now, for those who were in my classes at Daniel's Church Melville College when I was 23, grown men in their late 50s now, they will sputter out their breakfasts with joy at the prospect of me being a disciplinarian, because I was so far away from that at the time. And most of my career was really in pastoral care. But you cannot be the person who young people come to looking for advice and help and things like that if you are not also the person who periodically has to kick their arse. And that's the combination that's absolutely vital. And sadly, I think it's a combination that's more or less missing in Scottish state education now. So lots of people caring, but lots of difficulty in the classroom with very badly behaved and poorly disciplined young people. So big issues to do with discipline and parents and parenting as well. So there's a big thing. And you have to start off by keeping your classrooms calm and safe for all the children.
And fun. It's got to be fun. It's got to be interesting. It's got to be joyous. And yes, you're right. Mistakes along the way are not catastrophic in a classroom. They're mere blips in a child's educational journey.
What doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Exactly.
People have to be resilient, and that resilience does not come about through the Duke of Edinburgh's award and abseiling down the side of a precipice. It comes about by actually being able to take lots of little knocks as you're going along, knocks that come from your teachers, knocks that come from head teachers, and knocks that come from your pals. It's about moving forward and gaining adulthood. And
I think, do you not think then that actually one of the problems in schools is that we've become so incredibly risk averse? Parents too, incredibly risk averse, wrapping kids up in cotton wool and,
completely.
oh no, it's not. my wee Jimmy kicking.
You at least are a parent. I'm not actually a parent at all. So I mean, parenting is something I've got really strong feelings about. But the just to talk a wee bit more about ethos and what matters in a school and what you're trying to inculcate into children as being really important values. I mean, clearly the most important value in any school has to be kindness. You have to actually be sure that what's going on in your school does not involve unkindness, doesn't involve bullying, etc. Now, the kids will fail at that. Of course, they'll be unkind sometimes to other people, but you have to ensure that the primary culture of moving forward for young people to understand about the importance of kindness in your life.
And let's remember the kids in this. In my experience, kids want structure. They want a sense of discipline because it makes them feel safe. They want to know where the line in the sand is.
Well, all educational evidence shows that.
Yeah, there has to be consequence for actions that are unacceptable within. You're hearing stories now. Well, I've got many friends that are still working in local authority schools that I'd just take my breath away.
One of the reasons that these behavioural problems in Scottish state schools continue is because most people wouldn't believe what was actually happening in Scottish state schools.
Yes.
That is particularly true of people who are politicians, policymakers, etc., because they're all over 40. Now, or mainly over 40. And at the end of the day, the kind of regime that you and I went through when we were at school, the kind of regime that our parents went through at school, is utterly, utterly different to what is going on in schools now.
Yeah.
You used the phrase line in the sand, and the phrase line in the sand was one that was much used by my deputy at Heriot's, Robert Dixon. I can name him because I can only say good things about him, genuinely. And that, it was absolutely true. When I was admitting young people to Heriot's, I used to say to them that it was great school, very successful school, and lovely kids being nice to each other. And I used to say it's like an enormous park in which there's lots to do and it's really interesting and joyous and lots of great teachers teaching you wonderful things. But at the edges of it is a big black forest. And we tell you right at the beginning, don't go into the forest. Don't go into the forest. And so almost nobody ever goes into the forest. But when they step into the forest, then they discover a different side to what goes on. And that's how it needs to be in all schools. And I don't think that's very much, people out there may just call me naive. Go on, call me naive.
No,
well, I'm with you. But I actually think that can happen in all schools. And there are lots of examples, sadly, almost all of them in England, because of the difference in autonomy in England, where schools full of disadvantaged children have beautifully behaved kids who are very kind and get on with each other and don't have episodes of violence and carrying of knives and things like that.
Well, I mean, it's not rocket science. I mean, the fact of the matter is, when you're an adult, you can't walk down the street and punch somebody in the nose. You'd get arrested. You would be done for assault. But in classrooms up and down the country, it's happening daily.
Well, the problem with this is that it used to be the case that it slid off the tongue to say that schools were microcosms of society. So it's a little bubble in which you get ready to be out there in the adult world. But there are literally things happening on one side of a school wall which are completely forgiven and treated in a particular kind of way, which are happening outside the school wall and are being treated as crimes, which is actually what they are. And my problem with that is that the view of young people as children. We've got to remember, as the Cabinet Secretary for Education said so memorably in Holyrood not that long ago, when we're talking about people in schools, we've got to remember that they're children. Now, that was more or less right. That's more or less exactly how she said it. And at the end of the day, if these children behave that badly out there in the street on a Saturday night, then there are two problems for them. One is the law, and that's the luckier option, because these kids who get off telling their teachers to fuck off and things like that, they're going to tell the wrong person to fuck off one day. They're going to end up with a knife in their throat. And that's the problem. The problem is we need all of us to learn self-discipline. if parents aren't so helpful as they used to be with regard to that, then at the end of the day, that's got to happen in schools.
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to what makes a great school. We're talking about a knowledge-based curriculum. It's not actually enough. You're teaching kids to be citizens in the real world, and good and valuable citizens.
But the point about the knowledge-based curriculum is that you have to have a knowledge-rich curriculum in schools, because you can't use the skills that schools teach you without having some basis, some bricks to build it. So the distinction, the simplistic distinction, is to say that at the moment, it's all about the theory of building the wall, but the young people have never handled a brick because they don't understand about, they are sufficiently lacking in knowledge. Now, part of the reason for that is that young people only go to school for 16% of their work, their lives. So we need to have an emphasis on sport and on drama and on music and on debating, which is my thing, and lots and lots and lots of other things, because those help young people develop into adults and into citizens, and they can become the responsible individuals and the effective citizens, or whatever it is the four capacities say, and while at the same time being successful learners because they've done the learning in the classroom.
Couldn't agree more. And that's probably the saddest aspect. When I moved from local authority into independent education, the big difference wasn't the quality of teaching. It was the quality of opportunity. That was the big difference. The access to sport, to the arts, to music, to drama, to clubs that were run after school, before school, during lunch. There was just so much that kids had an opportunity to try. And I remember taking a kid from a local secondary school who came here and ended up, strangely, Scottish pole vaulting champion. Now, that would never have been discovered had she not had access to sport. And one of the other aspects of my life, Cameron, is that I'm now involved in a care home looking after children in care. And I remember speaking to a professional who said that the most important thing, particularly for boys, going through those teenage years where there are so many opportunities for alcohol abuse, drugs, getting in with the wrong crowd, the best way to avoid that is getting them involved in a sporting club, whether it's boxing or football or rugby, not so much cricket in Scotland, but cricket's big here too, tennis, anything to get rid of their energy, to cope with those hormonal changes, to be either as an individual sport or even better part of a team, working together, learning all that kind of stuff is crucial.
Oh, it's completely crucial. The problem is that, of course, there are going to be people out there listening to this. Well, actually, some of the people have switched off already.
Yeah.
Because they'll just have concluded we're like two reactionary old generals in a care home in Cheltenham or something, talking about this. What boys need is sport. What girls need is sport, Stella. And what boys need is drama and dance, and what girls need is drama and dance. I mean, the point is that what we need to avoid is being accused of gendering and of these kind of things. The point is that young people need to be involved in lots and lots of things that involve mixing with other people, whether as a team or as individuals, but they need to be out there mixing. And of course, the opposite is happening at the moment because they are moving so much into themselves, and the great villain here is social media, the phone. I confess I'm completely obsessed with my phone, but I also have lots and lots of friends. So if they sometimes don't even excuse me for looking at my phone in between courses at dinner and stuff like that. But what you have to have is a situation in which young people through schools have access to all these kinds of things. You need to pay teachers for doing them, though.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. And of course, with those opportunities, it's not just the opportunity in getting them outside of themselves. It's those young people can suddenly find a passion or a talent for something that they would never have known they had. And that's also massively important for a young person, to suddenly find, I'm not particularly academic, I don't particularly like school, but oh boy, I just joined this club and I am good at this and I love it and I've found a passion. It's awakened something in me.
Yeah, the other thing is about the school as community, how you identify yourself as a person. So if somebody says to me, who are you? where do you start? I'm a man, I'm Scottish, in my case, I'm gay, I have a partner, here are things that I like to do, which in-groups am I in? Now, young people, I think, find themselves in less and less of these formal in-groups because they do less things, they do less stuff in the way that we would have done in the past, when there were actually, of course, so many less choices. So you were 10 years old, you went to school, you went to the Cubs, some people went to church, that was never exactly a major part of my life. You had a pen pal in the United States of America, you liked music, so you had music lessons. There were limitations on the number of things that you could do. And now the number of things you can do is almost unlimited, but young people actually do less of them and they do them in a more fragmented way. And I think that brings them into less contact with people. And I think that's very, very, very unhealthy. So if in your school, your great school with your great teachers and a knowledge-rich curriculum, lots of extracurricular opportunities, has to be founded on some meeting place between pastoral care and discipline.
Well, that's it for this episode of Two Heads Are Better Than One. We hope you've enjoyed our journey through the world of schools, leadership and everything in between. If you've got thoughts, questions or stories of your own, we'd love to hear them. And you can reach us on rodandcameron@gmail.com. Make sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss the next episode, which will focus on behaviour, discipline, sanctions and pastoral care. And if you enjoyed today's chat, leaving a quick review really helps more listeners find us. And remember, in education and in life, two heads really are better than one. Thanks for listening. Class dismissed.